right, everyone, welcome. Good evening. Thank you all for joining us here on this wonderful Thursday night in the summer, just after Midsummer's Eve, actually. So wonderful to see you all here. And what we have tonight is going to be a little bit of an appetite whetter. Next Saturday, July 3rd, we are going to be participating again in the wonderful commemoration of the Battle and Massacre of Wyoming that the Wyoming Commemorative Association does every year. It's a wonderful event. We at the Luzerne County Historical Society are always very proud, very grateful to be a part of it. And it's doubly special this year because it's going to be on July 3rd. It's going to be on the actual day of the battle, which is a fun little thing that only happens once every so many years when the 4th falls on a Sunday. So it'll be extra special this year, and it'll be extra special because last year was only the second time that we weren't able to do it. From 1878 on, we've only missed 2, and once was for Agnes, which I suppose is fitting with yesterday being the anniversary, and then once, of course, was last year for COVID-19. So we're going to have a little preview with that today. But before I introduce Dr. Lewis and let him take us down this route, you have to get a little bit of a commercial here for the Historical Society. We, of course, are going to be part of the Commemorative Association's event next week, but that's not our event. We do have going on, also online currently, it started today and it runs through Sunday, we have our 3rd online auction. These have been very popular. People really seem to enjoy them. We have books, we have maps, posters, lithographs, actual physical artifacts, bowls and jars and things, as well as memberships to the Historical Society, different prints, postcards, that sort of thing. So the links are available on our website. They're available on Facebook, on Instagram. I think they're on Twitter as well. So if you go on to Octria, you go in, you register. It's really quick. It's really easy. And then it pretty much just works like eBay. It's just a different platform. And hopefully on Sunday, you'll win some stuff and we'll be mailing them to you next week. And then you'll have a nice book or poster or something to hang in your office. Also in July, at the end of July, we're going to be partnering with the Rail Riders again, the Scranton Wilkes-Barre Rail Riders. We're doing a group night out at baseball game. So we have tickets available for that. They're only $15 each, and we get half and the Rail Riders get half. It's a really nice deal they have going for us. And it's going to be Friday, July 23rd. And there's going to be fireworks after the game and the whole 9 yards. So if you're interested in that, give us a call at the Historical Society or email us at reservations@luzernehistory.org. It'll go right to me, and you'll be able to get tickets for that as well. And then hopefully come August, we're going to start doing in-person events again. We're doing a soft opening of the Nathan Dennison House on July 3rd. The reenactment of the capitulation is going to happen afterwards. Then throughout August, we're going to have the Nathan Dennison House open regular hours. The Swetland Homestead is going to be open for a few weekends as well, going into September. And hopefully in the fall, we're going to pick back up where we left off really in 2019, if we're being honest. So hopefully we'll get there sooner rather than later. But tonight we have one of our last virtual events. And as with all of our virtual events, this is a series that is funded through grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, through the Pennsylvania Humanities Council, and through Luzerne County and the CARES Act. So without that funding, we wouldn't be able to do any of this. We wouldn't be able to have a YouTube channel. We wouldn't be able to do our online blog, any of the virtual content we've been putting out over the last year. It just wouldn't be possible. So if any of your friends missed this tonight, if they're upset, if for whatever reason they weren't home or they couldn't get in or whatever, it's going to be on YouTube probably by Monday or Tuesday, along with all of our other digital content. They'll be able to see it there. So, okay, enough of a commercial. It's time to turn it over to Dr. Lewis. Our speaker this evening is Dr. William V. Lewis, Jr., who is a past president and, of course, a current board member of the Luzerne County Historical Society. Professionally, he's the managing principal, certified financial planner, and certified portfolio manager of Lewis, Litinsky, and Associates at Wells Fargo, located currently in Wilkes-Barre. Bill received his bachelor's degree and MBA from Wilkes University, a master's in financial services from the American College, a master's degree in American history from Pace University, and a master's degree in public administration and doctorate from Lehigh University. Bill, leave a few degrees for the rest of us, huh? It's hard.
I can try, yeah.
He currently serves as a commissioner for the Pennsylvania Historic and Museum Commission, where he chairs the State Historic Marker Selection Committee, and he's an officer for the Wyoming Commemorative Association, as we said, and he's also an officer for the Hollenback Cemetery, another wonderful local historical organization we have here. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. William Lewis.
Mark, thank you so much. I'm going to, as Mark said, give you just a little bit of an appetizer for next Saturday, a week Saturday's presentation at the monument. The speaker this year comes to us from Virginia. He's a young man who just finished his master's degree at the Virginia Commonwealth University. And his master's thesis was on the Battle of Wyoming, and particularly the propaganda, if you will, the publicity impact of that battle on both the revolution as well as on the War of 1812. So just it'll be a terrific speech. By day, he's an interpreter at the church in Richmond, where Patrick Henry did his "Give Me Liberty" or "Give Me Death" speech. So he basically professionally lives history every day. So I think he'll be a great speaker. He's a young man. I think it'll be very, very refreshing to listen to him. So you're all welcome to attend. The event is free. It's on Saturday the 3rd, as Mark said, the 243rd anniversary of the Battle of Wyoming, and it starts at 10 o'clock at the Wyoming Monument National Historic Site. So Mark, if you would advance the slide one more, I will get started. At the east portico entrance of the United States House of Representatives chamber in the U.S. Capitol, there are bronze doors that depict 8 key and important moments in American history and the American Revolution. Designed by American sculptor Thomas Crawford while he was in Rome from 1855 to 1857, the doors were finally executed in bronze between 1863 and 1867 and shipped from Italy right after the completion, only to be left in storage at the Capitol until 1905, when they were finally installed. Now, among the epic events of the Revolution that are depicted on these 2 doors are the Battle of Lexington, the first reading of the Declaration of Independence, the signing of the Treaty of Paris, which of course ended the Revolution, Washington's farewell to his officers. And if you look at the door to our left, right below the star, that very top panel, you can see the depiction of the Wyoming Massacre, or as we often call it, the Battle of Wyoming. To Americans living in the 19th century, the 1800s, the Battle of Wyoming was considered a key moment in American Revolutionary War history. As the 20th century moved on, as historians began to reassess the American Revolution and the significance and impact of various battles and events, the Battle of Wyoming began to take on less significance. Indeed, had an impressive monument not been built over the course of 65 years after the battle, and had the 100th anniversary of the battle not been celebrated in the grand manner that it was, the story of this Rev War event may have been mostly lost in our history. 100 years after the battle, a massive series of events were held locally to recall the conflict. All the while, the story was still much alive and documented at virtually every level in American history. The events of that celebration in 1878 led to the founding of an organization that, through continuing annual observances and publications, helped to promote, interpret, and examine all aspects of the Massacre of Wyoming. And I'm talking about the Wyoming Commemorative Association, which of course will sponsor next Saturday's event. Looking at the Battle of Wyoming, really from the history of history perspective, stories of the event fit the classic story of horror and sacrifice of American patriots. By the time the story of Wyoming began to be examined by progressive historians, there initially was little here of apparent interest. While farmers did struggle here against an alien power, the people they struggled against had already been mistreated, and the story of Native American brutality had become old school and was no longer readily accepted by the changing community of historians. To the emerging New Left historians of the late 20th century, there was little here of interest, as the battle was not a struggle against oppressive landholders. Indeed, the people struggling were the landowners. It was not until recently, with the publication of several recent proceedings of the Wyoming Commemorative Association, that more modern theories looking at the history have been applied to the battle. The idea of examining the event in light of social history, of efforts of common men and women to save their families and their homes at great sacrifice, have all been re-examined. Most recently, and I'll talk briefly about it later, in a book called Wild Yankees, Professor Paul Moyer looked at the battles as an overall part of the struggles of the settlers in the area against the ingrained power interests of Pennsylvania, and how the battle helped to shape a struggle that had both preceded it and then succeeded it. The tale of the battle was once a storied part of our nation's struggle for independence, accounts of which were part of most early American history books and school texts. It was a story of how old men and young boys left the fort that they were protecting at 40 Fort to defend their community from the attacking loyalist Tories and savage Native Americans, only to be defeated and then brutally captured and tortured. The famous Scottish poet, Thomas Campbell, immortalized the event in the poem Gertrude of Wyoming, portraying the area where the battle took place to be idyllic before the conflict and destroyed thereafter. His way in the early 1800s of depicting a paradise lost. The military cry, "Remember Wyoming," was used throughout the American Revolution to energize the Continental troops as they prepared for battles. Even the name Wyoming gained so much recognition and popularity that when Congress was creating a new Western territory in 1868, it gave the territory the name Wyoming in remembrance of the Pennsylvania battle. For a community whose story by 1778 was not quite 10 years old and already fairly bizarre because of the Yankee Pennamite Wars in the area, this attention was unique. And Mark, if you'd advance the slide, please. Settled in 1869 by Connecticut settlers who had come to believe that under the terms of King Charles the Grand, there's of course King Charles sitting there, King Charles's land grant to Connecticut in 1662, they believed much of northern Pennsylvania was within their charter's geographic jurisdiction. Now, almost immediately, the Penn family, the proprietors of Pennsylvania, vehemently objected to the Connecticut settlements in what they claimed was their territory under the charter given by the same king to William Penn in 1682. Various attempts to oust the New Englanders, first taking the form of threats and harassment, but the attempts to recover the land eventually evolved into a series of battles between the Connecticut people and the Pennsylvania forces known as the Yankee Pennamite Wars. The land battles continued right up to the start of the Revolution and promptly restarted almost right after the end of the Revolution. By 1778, the Connecticut settlers had not only raised a local Connecticut militia here in the Wyoming Valley and had sent it off to join the Continental Army, but the locals here also were sending representatives to the Connecticut legislature to represent them. It was a very strange locality that horror would arrive to during the Revolutionary War in 1778. So what really occurred at what was then called Wyoming in Pennsylvania that led to all this attention? More importantly, why did the battle become such a well-recognized event? What happened during the battle may very well have been a result of actions and decisions that took place very far away in London in early 1778. On March 8th, 1778, Lord George Germain, the British Secretary of State for the Colonies, sent instructions to British General Sir Henry Clinton, advising him that the British cabinet was ordering him to redirect his military efforts to the southern part of the American colonies. Suspecting there was greater loyalist support for maintaining British control in the southern colonies, and frankly, recognizing that those areas had, in many cases, 2, if not 3 growing seasons for the important agricultural products that Britain and all of Europe and the British colonies in the Caribbean sought, the cabinet had decided to change the military efforts away from New England and the Mid-Atlantic colonies. From an economic standpoint, the South, as I mentioned, was more viable, had greater ability to grow cash crops, and because of its proximity to the British sugar islands of the West Indies. Germain's instructions told Clinton to retain British control over New York City and Newport, Rhode Island, and to conduct maritime raids on New England and the coastal cities, but to focus primarily on securing the southern colonies. Clinton was also ordered to reinforce British military strength in both Florida and Canada. About the same time, Sir William Howe, the then British commanding general of the colonies, wrote to Lord Germain advising him that the American military was planning an expedition to invade Canada. In time, Howe would advise his London superiors that the invasion had fallen apart for lack of American troop strength. But soon the governor of Canada, Frederick Hollenback, requested reinforcements anyway, assuming an invasion was all but inevitable. So what would the British do to keep the colonists occupied to avoid the invasion of Canada while also forcing continental troops to be distracted as a full force British occupation of the South as that was about to begin? Well, from the British perspective, the use of loyalists and Indians to raid the frontier areas of New York and Pennsylvania represented a brilliant military strategy. The raids would tie down Patriot military forces that could be used elsewhere in direct confrontation with the British troops. The use of alternative forces would free up the British military to pursue their main focus, and the frontier towns raided in fast terroristic attacks would demand continental soldiers to protect them. It would also be an outlet for revenge on the part of many of the loyalists, some of whom were former residents of New York, for instance, who had lost their lands at the hands of local patriots. And they sought to remove those loyal to the crown from New York State. For the Native Americans who had become part of this force, their long loyalty to the British, compounded with their overall treatment that they had received from patriotic forces, ensured that they would be a cooperative part of this new British military adventure. In a letter from British Indian Superintendent Guy Johnson to Lord Germain in March 1778, Johnson expressed his concerns that a native fighter might prove ineffective in larger battles without British Army support, and noted, quote, "Before the arrival of many troops, unless we were to let loose to carry on petite guerre," which is in their own way, the French term meaning a small war using raiding and very nasty ambush techniques. And Mark, if you'd advance it. The attack on the Wyoming settlement, showing, as I'm showing here in the slide, the loyalist or Tory commander, John Butler, but the attack on the Wyoming settlement here in Pennsylvania started with the arrival of Colonel Butler and his force of Butler's Rangers, together with Native Americans, the group totaling far more than 600 people, arriving in the Wyoming Valley on June 30th, 1778. The invaders surprised locals working in the fields. They scalped some of them while taking 8 prisoners. On the following day, small local forts were attacked and burned. Butler then tried to get the largest local fort at the settlement called 40 Fort to surrender, but this was refused. In the late afternoon of July 3rd, 1778, knowing that the Loyalist and Native American forces were headed for their fort, a patriot group of about 350 people left the fort to defend their community. Most of the men had no military experience. with active Continental fighters mostly away in Washington's army. By chance, a local man with extensive military experience was home on leave, and it was Colonel Zebulon Butler's into his hands that the leadership of this basically ragtag group of people was given. It's surprising that the group did not remain inside 40 Fort, which was fairly well reinforced from attack, but perhaps the group underestimated the size of the Loyalist and Indian attackers. The decision to confront the raiders may also have been motivated by Lazarus Stewart, a member of the Pennsylvania's infamous Paxton Boys, originally from South Central Pennsylvania, the Lancaster area. And he was known for his reputation for killing Indians with little regard as to whether they were peaceful or not. After an hour's march, the Patriot troops met the Loyalists and formed a line of attack in a mostly flat area in what we now call Exeter, with the exception of a swampy area to the Patriot line's left side. And if you've gone or walked in that area, if you drive off to the left on Valley Street or any of the side streets in Exeter, you'll notice a train track that is raised, and that actually the land on the other side is much lower. That was a natural swamp. And it was in that area that the Native Americans were plotting their attack, kind of attacking from the left flank. After a few volleys at extreme distance from the Loyalists, it appeared that the battle was going nowhere when suddenly the group of Indians hidden on the other side, as I mentioned, attacked on the left. The Patriots' second in command, Colonel Nathan Dennison, gave orders for the Patriots to wheel to the left, which was generally interpreted by the inexperienced soldiers to mean retreat. The native warriors hunted down the retreating Patriots, showing little mercy to any of them, even as they tried to surrender. The Americans were shot or tomahawked to death and scalped. The natives were paid in the typical British fashion for each scalp they retrieved, so there was a definite economic incentive to intensify the terrorism. That was part of the strategy. That evening, accounts of the battle claimed that the Patriot survivors were burned at the stake, and legend has it that around a large rock, almost a dozen brave Patriot captives were killed by an Indian woman who danced and sang as she tomahawked the captive heads on the stone. Whether it was truly Queen Esther is still highly in doubt, but that's the name assigned to it by tradition. Even Loyalist Major John Butler admitted that the Native Americans were brutal during and after the battle. In a letter to Lieutenant Colonel Mason Bolton, written on July 8th, 1778, Butler noted, quote, "In the action were taken 227 scalps and only 5 prisoners. The Indians were so exasperated with their loss last year near Fort Stanwix that it was with greatest difficulty I could save the lives of these few." Butler went on to note that his troops had burned 8 forts and well over 1,000 houses. In a twist of compassion, while he noted that the Indians were brutal to the Patriot fighters, he also noted that no person that was without arms was either injured or killed in the attack. The New York Journal of July 20th, 1778 gave a very different account of the aftermath of the battle, noting that homes were attacked, quote, "with the women and children in the houses. They set fire to them and they all perished together in the flames," unquote. Already in the course of just a few weeks, the story of what happened at Wyoming was changing as the American news sought to emphasize or even exaggerate the horrors committed by the Loyalist side, while the British military reported how civil they were during the conflict, except, of course, for the Indian committed aftermath, which Major Butler claimed he could not control. The reality of what happened was probably somewhere in the middle of all these accounts. Clearly, Major Butler was partially fabricating some of his reports. In the surrender documents signed on the day after the battle, July 4th, 1778, Butler agreed to allow the inhabitants of the area to live peacefully as long as they laid down their arms. Nathan Dennison, who had served as second in command on the Patriot side, and who negotiated the surrender, noted how the document was intended to guarantee the safety of the people of the community once the agreement was signed, and yet he witnessed on the very day after the surrender the remains of 5 people who had been murdered by the Loyalists and Indians on the road leaving the area. The settlers killed as they attempted to flee to return to their native Connecticut. News reports of the battle quickly found their way to the settlers' home colony in Connecticut. In an article less than 3 weeks after the battle, it was claimed that the conflict had lasted 1 to 2 hours, far longer than any eyewitness account, and that only 30 Patriot soldiers survived. It was also noted in a community of about 5,000, half the population had been killed or taken prisoner. Again, an exaggeration. Already the horrors of the event were being magnified and the story was being changed. On August 3rd, 1778, the Boston Gazette reported that the battle the same way they did in the edition of August 8th Gazette in New York City. By September of 1778, the North Carolina Gazette ran its own version of the event. The story, in various forms and in various levels of truth, was being reported throughout all of the American colonies. The battle gained international attention when a story largely reflecting the horrible yet incorrect version of the events was previously published, that had been previously published in the New York Journal, appeared in Edmund Burke Dodley's Register for the year 1779, which was published in London. The tale of the Battle of Wyoming had reached an international audience and was sure to attract ongoing attention in historical writings. And in fact, it did. In 1804, U.S. Supreme Court Justice John Marshall began to write a massive biography of George Washington using paper and documents that had been given to him by Washington's family. The book became more than that. It became a multi-volume, sweeping history of early America, in addition to being the first serious biography of George Washington and Marshall's position of Chief Justice of the United States, together with the fact that Marshall himself had served in the Continental Army, helped to attract subscribers for his multi-volume work. And if you're interested, by the way, in seeing that work, it is available on many different sites on the web, totally for free. I believe it's in Google Books. If you just put John Marshall, the biography of George Washington, you'll find multiple volumes that he wrote. The book became an instant success and an authoritative source for many years on the works in American history. Included in the 3rd volume of that book was an account of the Battle of Wyoming and its aftermath. The inclusion of the event meant it would be a moment in history, often cited in other works for many decades to come. Of course, and Mark, if you'd move the slide forward, one of the greatest boosts of attention, particularly to an international audience, came for the battle in the 1809 publication by this man, Scottish poet Thomas Campbell, and his poem, Gertrude of Wyoming. As I mentioned before, the poem portrays the Wyoming Valley as having been an idyllic paradise, one that was destroyed by invasion and atrocities committed by loyalists and Indians. The poem talks about the swans that floated on the river. Of course, I don't believe there were ever any swans here, but it was a very picturesque story of paradise lost. While the poem was very historically inaccurate, it rapidly gained popularity, fueling the story of horrors committed at Wyoming. Another significant work bringing attention to the battle came in 1920, when a book published in Ireland relating the history of North America referred to the events at Wyoming in the following way. Quote, of the butcheries perpetrated among the colonists in one particular stained the British annals with indelible infamy. A band of 1,600 Indians and royalists invaded the settlement at Wyoming, gaining possession of some forts by treacherous promises and others by force, they put to death all of the inhabitants of both sexes and of every age, some thousands of number, including enclosing some of the buildings which they set on fire and roasting others alive. They maimed all the cattle and left them to expire in agonies, unquote. Again, a lot of exaggeration because the story just kept building up and building up. It was in the first decade of the 19th century, right around the time when the poem Gertrude of Wyoming was appearing for readers around the globe, that local residents in the Wyoming Valley began to pay any real attention again to the battle, and they started to discuss the idea of building a permanent monument to commemorate the battle. Now, early attempts to organize a group to raise funds for the construction were somewhat successful, but as fundraisers, they could get a group together, but they couldn't raise too much money. Every few years, a new group would organize and try to pull together the funds needed to build the monument, but the failure would take place for almost 30 years. By the third decade of the 19th century, a new dilemma was causing a problem. No one could remember where the actual bodies of the victims of the battle had been buried. Area leaders knew that in the fall of 1778, months after the battle had taken place, that a military detachment had returned to the area where the battle was fought to remove the scattered bodies. Accounts of the activity described the work as easy, as the summer of 1778 had been particularly hot and human remains were so dried out that they merely had to be, quote, tossed with pitchforks onto wooden carts, unquote. A massive grave had been dug and the bodies were interred there, and the dirt was replaced, putting a large boulder on top. Yet years of farming in the area of the mass grave had basically obliterated its location. In the spring of 1832, two local rival Democratic political clubs in the Wyoming Valley took up a challenge to locate the burial field. Each group offered a prize of $20 to the person who could find the remains of those killed during the battle. A gentleman who had owned and farmed a field where they believed the bones were buried came forward to the local Democratic Hickory Club and offered his service. Armed with a barbed iron rod, the man returned several hours later to claim his prize, certain he had found the correct location. And he was correct. He had found the burial spot. And Mark, if you'd move forward. On March 3rd, 1832, the community held a very special event. So remarkable, it was covered by a journalist representing Niles Weekly Register, which was kind of like the Newsweek and Time magazine of the era. Amidst a massive crowd, with popular local preachers offering sermons, a small group of men worked diligently on a task, that of extracting the remains of the bodies of the victims of the Battle of Wyoming. Now, when an interesting human bone was found, one with a tomahawk mark or a bullet hole, the bone was passed around the large crowd for close personal inspection. Now, the sheer gruesomeness of the event became even greater when the fact is that there were actually several survivors of the battle in attendance, as well as children of some of the significant, some of the people who were killed there. So, I think this may be from your buddy, this bone. It's pretty gruesome. One of the preachers, Reverend Nicholas Murray, holding in his hand a human skull that had just been extracted with a very distinct tomahawk mark in it, proclaimed that a monument would soon be built that would offer a message to the world. Quote, "Stop, traveler, here rest the ashes of the Wyoming heroes." It's no wonder that the historical accounts would continue to give attention to the battle. With little success in developing fundraising for the monument, only an underground vault was completed by next year. And the picture I'm showing you, part of that building is actually still here on Wyoming Avenue, Wyoming, just north of the Wyoming Shopping Center on the same side as the monument. That was actually William Swetland's store. And from the time that they extracted the bones in 1832 until July 3rd of 1833, the bones were actually stored in wooden boxes in one of the storerooms in this building. As I said, part of the original building is still there. It looks very different today. It's a white stuccoed building, but it's there. And so we have a little tie to history. By the way, William Swetland's future son-in-law by the name of Payne Pettibone actually slept in the room where the bones were kept. So he never reported any kind of roommate problems, though. I guess they were pretty quiet. On July 3rd, 1833, on the 55th anniversary of the battle, the cornerstone for the future monument was dedicated at an event. The bones, held in cardboard boxes for the past year, were taken to the site of the monument's construction, and again, the bones were all put on public display. This event also had numerous speakers, sermons, and military salutes. At the end of the event, the organizers realized that no door or cover had been made to secure the bones in their newly built crypt, so they were basically unceremoniously returned to the storehouse that had sheltered them for the past year. Finally, in December of 1833, the burial vault was secured and the bones were forever interred in it. And it is completely under the base of the monument. So when you go through the bronze door on the back of the monument, you're not going to see any of the victims of the battle. But the monument once again faced decades of constant start and stop construction, as money to pay for the structure was very slowly raised. In 1835, and Mark, if you'd move the slide forward, another historical event came to the forefront, helping to add to the overall Wyoming story and help to keep the tales of the Revolutionary War era in the Wyoming Valley in the public's mind for decades. After the battle, in 1778, most of the residents of the valley fled from their homes, many returning to the native Connecticut. But one local family, who were Quakers and felt they had a good relationship with the Native Americans, would stay on their land in Wilkes-Barre. And of course, I refer to the Slocum family, and this is a print of the kidnapping of Francis Slocum. The Slocum family lived and farmed in what's now downtown Wilkes-Barre, but in 1778, they were still very far away from the most populated areas of the village that was then called Westmoreland. In November 1778, Mr. Jonathan Slocum, Francis Slocum's father, was away from the family home when a band of Native Americans attacked. They killed him. They kidnapped 5-year-old Francis and a neighbor boy. Francis would never see her parents again. Her sister, after the attackers had left, ran to the village fort, which was on public square, and raised the alarm. And yet, despite a massive search of the area, neither of the children were found. Now, it wasn't uncommon for Indian tribe members to kidnap small children from the frontier, often giving the children to tribal members who themselves had lost their children to disease. But there were very few instances during the time of families ever learning the fate of those kidnapped children. Francis was taken to Niagara, migrating through to the Detroit area, and finally settling in what is now Indiana. And during her life, she married twice, had 4 children, all the while living the lifestyle of a member of the Miami tribe and speaking no English. If you'd move it forward, Mark. In 1835, Frances told a local Indian trader her story while he was visiting her village. She recalled being kidnapped, that her father often wore a broad hat, typical of Quakers of the era, and that her family's name was Slocum, and that she lived as a child near the Susquehanna River. She also carried with her a damaged finger, still disfigured from an injury that she had as a very young child on her father's farm. Now, that Indian trader, in an attempt to find her family, wrote a letter to the post office in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, but for 2 years, the letter was misplaced. It finally made its way into the local Lancaster newspaper, and that paper was delivered to a preacher here in the Wyoming Valley. It was then that the newspaper was sent to Francis's brother, Joseph Slocum, who still lived in Wilkes-Barre, operating a bookstore and stationery store on Public Square. In September 1837, Joseph Slocum, his 2 brothers and a sister, all traveled to Indiana to see the sister they had lost almost 59 years before. Her family begged her to return with them to the Wyoming Valley, but she refused, telling them that she was now an Indian, that her children were Indians, and that she was an old woman who had lived her present lifestyle for too long. She didn't want to change. Almost instantly, the news media of the nation was transfixed by her story and her nobility of staying with her Native American family. Within a year, treaties signed by the Miami tribe were scheduled to force Frances and her family to join the tribe in a forced relocation to Kansas. The Slocum family used the fame gained from the story to ask the U.S. Congress to pass a bill to exempt Frances's family from the forced westward relocation. And in the meantime, her brother Joseph was an honored guest at the 1841 presidential inaugural of President William Henry Harrison, who Frances knew well from his time when Harrison was the Indiana territorial governor. In 1845, Congress passed a joint resolution exempting Slocum and her family from removal to Kansas, and she was granted 620 acres of land in Indiana. The celebrity Frances gained, including the title, The Lost Sister of Wyoming, would become a companion historical account to the Battle of Wyoming, given the story's prominent places in history books of the 1800s. Now, meanwhile, back in the Wyoming Valley, the progress of building the monument still dragged on. Effort to get the U.S. Congress to fund the project came of nothing, and a petition sent to the state of Connecticut to help pay for the structure to honor their war dead was also rebuffed. Finally, in 1841, women in the community banded together to form the Ladies Monumental Association, and it was this group, through a series of events such as dinners and town fairs, that finally raised the funds needed to complete the construction of the monument. The monument's capstone was put in place in 1843, and by 1860, the all-female Wyoming Monument Association gained title to the land on which the monument had been placed and built. Mark, if you could move forward. In June of 1877, a small group of community leaders got together to discuss how the 100th anniversary of the battle should be celebrated. America had just gone through in 1876, the 100th anniversary of the beginning of the nation, and it was an elaborate series of events and a World's Fair in Philadelphia. Over the next 12 months, it was now Wyoming Valley's opportunity to celebrate its tie to the American Revolution, and a series of major events were planned for July of 1878. The entire nature of the event was changed, however, when just a few days before the functions were to begin, a letter arrived on June 22nd, 1878, advising members of the organizing committee that the President of the United States, Rutherford B. Hayes, would be coming to attend the celebrations. Elaborate preparations were made for the president's visit. A full-scale reproduction of 40 Fort was built directly on top of the excavated remains of the original fort. A massive day-long program in Wyoming was planned, a parade in Wilkes-Barre, as well as several days of evening fireworks and other celebrations were all part of the event that was set up. On July 3rd, 1878, exactly 100 years after the battle, more than 50,000 people turned out to see the president and to attend the formal anniversary ceremonies. Hayes arrived together with the U.S. Attorney General and the Secretary of the Treasury, and also the governor of Pennsylvania, and he addressed a massive crowd, which actually included a group of Native Americans dressed in full war paint and feathers, some of whom were descendants of the warriors who had fought on the Loyalist side during the battle. Hayes used the opportunity not only to reflect on the battle and the American Revolution, but to talk about his ongoing policies relating to containing the American Indian populations. Now, what's interesting, if you go back and read his speech, which is published in a number of places in the fashion of the times, he and other speakers referred to the Indians as red savages and children of the forest. The event gained national media attention, and on the very next day, July 4th, 1878, stories ran in major newspapers like the New York Daily Herald, the Baltimore Sun, the Boston Post, the Times-Picayune, and the Des Moines Register, to name just a few. The New York Sun, in a front page story that day, reported on the event, saying that it celebrated the massacre, quote, when early Connecticut settlers fell victim to savage cruelty and Tory hate. Mark? Having enjoyed the considerable spotlight that focused on the 100th anniversary of the battle, the organizing committee decided to form itself into a permanent group, one that would hold an annual observance at the monument, dedicating to pay tribute to those who had fought at the battle. The annual event, which slowly moved to July 4th each year for crowds and convenience, became a forum for scholars, politicians, and other famed speakers to offer their public addresses together with the traditional band concert and floral tributes. An important educational tradition started in the early 1800s when the Wyoming Commemorative Association, or in the early 1880s, I should say, the name of the new organization began to publish the annual addresses of its keynote speakers. That tradition, which continues to this day, has been a forum for scholars to share their thoughts and changing interpretation of the events and the impact of the battle. Prominent historians, including several Pulitzer Prize winners, have addressed the event since 1879 with a scholarship published in the widely distributed annual booklet called the Proceedings of the Wyoming Commemorative Association. Now, this has become a source of inquiry and sometimes debate, as speakers have often presented exhaustive studies on topic such as who the Indian leaders were or were not at the battle, the role the event may have played in the overall military strategy, and even views of the battle from the purely British perspective. Mark? By the late 19th century, as scholarship in Canadian history began to take a life of its own, several works emerged examining in part the battle from the Loyalist perspective. Again, the people who were the enemies here became the heroes of Canada, and some of them settled actually in Niagara and Niagara-on-the-Lake and became the town fathers there. In 1893, Canadian author Ernest Cruikshank wrote a small book entitled The Story of Butler's Rangers and the Settlement of Niagara. Given the fact that Loyalist Butler and several of his fellow Rangers became the respected town fathers of the area in and around Niagara-on-the-Lake, Ontario, it's not surprising that their role in the Revolution, including at Wyoming, would become a part of Canadian history. In his work, Cruikshank discusses the trials of many of the Loyalist Rangers endured, including their harassment and forced displacement by pro-revolution settlers in New York State. Now, Cruikshank attributed much of the military action and aggression on the part of the Loyalists to bitterness over the loss of their homes and property, and he tried to justify their attack on the Wyoming settlement as retribution to the Connecticut immigrants who had defied the provincial authorities in Pennsylvania by occupying much of northeastern Pennsylvania. Likewise, military efforts of the Loyalists, particularly Butler's Rangers, is seen as a proactive way of keeping their new Canadian homeland from being attacked and invaded. Cruikshank also pointed out that ongoing harassment in 1778 of peaceful Loyalists still living in the greater Wyoming settlement area, together with Native American perceptions that their lands had been stolen from them, were reasons for their attack. He further points out the liberal surrender terms given by Butler to the residents of Wyoming, stating that only, quote, strong men flying from a lost battle were subject to post-battle Indian murder and torture, with prisoners, women, and children being unmolested after the battle. This was a very different view of the battle than what had almost become American legend in American history. In 1896, Canadian historian William Kirby wrote that the men of the Loyalist Rangers went into Wyoming area not only to break up the frontier settlements, but to also bring help to Loyalist families living in the Wyoming settlement to the safety of Niagara, noting the families were suffering under constant harassment by, quote, American rebels. In 1933, American historian Howard Swigert wrote the book War Out of Niagara, Walter Butler and the Tory Rangers, which focused on John Butler's son, Walter, who led the Butler Rangers attack on the Cherry Valley during the Cherry Valley Massacre later in 1778, and who was killed in the skirmish of 1781. Swigert affirmed that most of the Rangers who had fought at Wyoming were actually born in the American colonies and were men angered by the loss of their land and homes. Clearly, the interpretation of the story of Wyoming was changing, at least from the Canadian perspective. By the mid-1930s, the Battle of Wyoming was beginning to fade from the broader study of American history. The Spanish-American War, the Civil War, World War I, were more contemporary and needed to be a greater part of the story. So battles of less attention from other wars would begin to fade. The battle had enjoyed a popular resurgence in 1928 for its sesquicentennial, and many events were held during that area, including, again, another huge thing at the monument, as well as all sorts of event in Wilkes-Barre. Mark? But by the early 1930s, even the annual ceremonies of the Wyoming Commemorative Association had become less focused on the battle. Patriotic themes were becoming popular in addresses such as the legal history of the Connecticut claim to northeastern Pennsylvania, evidenced in the address of 1935 of Wesleyan University historian George Dutcher. Even broader themes of Pennsylvania history were addressed when Lawrence Henry Gibson, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author and a renowned researcher of British North America, addressed the topic of 2 centuries of age of Pennsylvania on July 4th, 1941. A different type of scholarship on the battle era was addressed in 1967 when poet Annette Evans addressed the topic of frontier women of the Wyoming Valley, beginning a change in who in battle history was being discussed. But a new and very different scholarship really didn't help to slow the erasure of the story of the Battle of Wyoming from history books and school texts. Rather, the passage of time with so much more American history to examine, as well as the changing focus of the Revolutionary War scholarship, began to dim and then delete the story of Wyoming from most popular American history books and textbooks. The Revolutionary War and new research was being examined from all perspectives, such as the role of women in the war, the role of slaves and African Americans, and as well as a much larger view of looking at the bigger Atlantic world struggle on several continents as the revolution waged. New and emerging ways to look at history have displaced many of the less well-known stories from the key storybook of our American Revolution. Still, there are recent moments when academics do bring the story of the Battle of Wyoming into focus. In 2002, Lisa Francavilla, a recent graduate with a master's degree in history from the College of William and Mary and now editor of the Thomas Jefferson papers at Monticello, focused her master's thesis and subsequent address at the Wyoming Monument on the story of the battle and how it had been dramatized by the refugees from Wyoming, either for effective propaganda or to motivate the American side in the war. Looking at the battle from the perspective as a source of propaganda or as an event that was being used to seek government assistance was a very different version of the story that had been so long in the public collective memory. Mark? In 2002, Paul B. Moyer, professor at State University of New York, wrote a book, Wild Yankees, to examine the many years of conflict between the Connecticut settlers in northeastern Pennsylvania and the Pennsylvania government. When discussing the battle, he concluded the American Revolution may have been a major distraction for the area, that the war was never fully able to keep people from their local struggles, and that the war simply helped to further inflame tensions, especially between the Native Americans who had passed through the area and the white settlers. Moyer argues that some of the real terrorism related to the battle was credited to the Indian forces, and among those brutally killed during the battle was Lazarus Stewart, a dedicated Indian hater known to the natives as a killer of Indians in South Central Pennsylvania. Moyer points out that the Connecticut records once accounted taxable persons in the Wyoming Valley. He notes that the records in early 1778 noted there were about 500 individuals counted in the Wyoming Valley, but by 1780, there were only 100 people in that count. These numbers would clearly challenge many of the British accounts as to the number of people killed or dislocated. So Moyer, again, is already changing some very long-held stories. So while the Battle of Wyoming may no longer occupy the pages in the works about the Revolution in so many school books or history books, it is still a historical event that is re-examined and reinterpreted by scholars as well as amateur historians alike. As long as the Wyoming Commemorative Association continues to exist and the people enjoy coming out to what has become a very traditional American observance of the 4th of July, additional literature and research will continue to be produced about the battle and its aftermath. If students of history are drawn to the brief yet unusual struggle that helped to create many memories of this event, the day of July 3rd, 1778 will always be remembered, and the stories of that moment and the impact of it will continue to be told. And I thank you so much for your kind attention. Mark?
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Lewis. That was wonderful.
You are welcome.
Ladies and gentlemen, you can, of course, if you have any questions for Dr. Lewis, you could type them in on the bottom of your screen on the text chat there. They will go right to me, and then I can go through them, and we could do a little Q&A session with Dr. Lewis there. I have a question while we have a minute here.
Sure.
Obviously, you were talking a lot about what historians and students of history, are writing and their level of interest in it. You've been with the Commemorative Association, I mean, forever, since as long as I've been.
Not since 1878. It was a year or two after that. Yeah, just kidding.
How do you see, from your perspective, from being involved so long, how do you see the interest level on the ground with the average person? Is it about the same?
I think it's actually increased over the years, and it'll be curious to see what our attendance is next Saturday. But the crowds continue to grow every year. I think partially because it's just such a great traditional, 4th of July time period celebration. But I also think there is a fair amount of interest in local history and of that moment in local history. I mean, it is the most significant Rev War battle in northeastern Pennsylvania. And, where it ties in with the big, part of what I didn't address is how the actual battle was one of the reasons that Washington had Sullivan do his march, which it effectively, many historians are now saying that Sullivan's march effectively pushed the Native Americans westward and was one of the earliest movements of forced relocation of Indians to the West, beginning a decades or century-long movement of the Native American population. So from that perspective, it is a significant part. And people are starting to recognize some of the very significant parts of how the battle fits in the overall story of the American Revolution.
Excellent. Very good. Thank you for your kind comments there, Jabrice. She says, excellent presentation, Dr. Lewis. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Like I said, if anyone has any questions, feel free to use the text chat there at the bottom. Of course, as we said, Jill, this coming Saturday, the 3rd, is going to be this year's ceremony. We're grateful for that. And then afterwards, you can go to the Dennison House. Of course, Colonel Dennison kind of got stuck holding the bag because he was a militiaman And as Dr. Lewis said, Colonel Butler, American Butler, was a Continental. And so the British were interesting because if you were a militiaman, they didn't really consider you a soldier.
Right.
So if they captured you, they just sort of, waved their finger at you and said, give us your guns and don't do it anymore. Whereas if you were a Continental, you were a POW. So Dennison stayed in the fort with the handful of men he had left and just kept saying, oh, no, I can hold out here forever. I can.
Right.
Waiting for Colonel Butler to go away. And then once he found out he was safety, okay, I'm going to swim. So,
Butler didn't have much of a choice. He had to get out of town quick. He would have been executed by the Tories and the Indians. But Dennison was left holding the bag in the end. He had to negotiate the surrender and everything else.
That is probably one of the most common questions we get at the Dennison House. Well, if he was the second in command, why did he have to surrender? Well, yeah. That's why.
And the Dennison House holds the actual table where the surrender, which ended up in the British archives, was signed inside the fort on July 4th, 1778.
Yes, we have the table. The British archives has the actual paper, and I believe West Point still has the battle standard.
Supposedly, the museum at West Point has the Tory flag that was used at the battle. Yes.
All right. Well, that's that. I don't see any questions here. So I guess that means you explained everything, Bill. Well done.
There you go. Yeah. Well, I want to invite everybody to the July 3rd this year, when the 3rd falls on a Saturday. That's what we do it then. And 10 o'clock in the morning at the Wyoming Monument. And the speaker, again, will touch on some of what I talked about, but I think he's going to be pretty laser focused on the actual aftermath in terms of public propaganda, PR, and the huge impact that the battle had on the rally, really the rallying cry for the rest of the revolution and for the War of 1812.
And one more time, Bill, just we got a question here. Who is the speaker again?
His name is Will Tharp. William Tharp. He's a young man. He's from Richmond, Virginia. He actually, I shared with him a whole bunch of materials on the battle and things that I had as he was working on his master's thesis. He found, with some of the archives completely shut down because of COVID, how he found some of the things he found. But I mean, just enormous amount of research. His thesis is 150, almost 200 pages long. And I've read through it, and it is just masterful. And I suspect the speech will be, the content of the speech I know is going to be just as good. So he'll be a great speaker.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to that. Dr.
Yeah,
Lewis,
we have, and the chair for that day, who's a member of the Historical Society Board, is Judge Jennifer Rogers from Luzerne County Courts. And so she will be the MC that day. So overall, it should be a great program.
Yeah, it's going to be high energy, which is good. Judge Rogers is great.
Yes.
We're going to have the band again this year, correct?
The band is there. Yep.
So it'll be
and a sound system and chairs. Anybody can. We hired a sound company this year to add a lot of speakers. So hopefully you can basically sit anywhere on the grounds. You're welcome to sit under the tent. But if you want to be socially distanced, you can go out on the grounds, sit, listen to the speaker, and you should be able to have a real good hear of everything.
Well, excellent.
Great.
Well, with no more questions that I can see, I guess we will end there. So once again, thank you, Dr. Lewis.
And thank everyone for their attention tonight. And I enjoyed doing this. Thank you so much.
And hopefully we'll see you all next week. And
look forward to seeing everybody at the monument.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.